Alright class, these series of videos will tackle Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy, and we will look at World War I, how it got started, how the United States got involved, and the consequences afterwards. The following objectives we should be able to accomplish by the end of these videos. Number one, state the basic features of Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy. We want to look at how Wilson's foreign policy differed from that of Roosevelt and Taft. And we also want to be able to explain how his features of foreign policy drew him into Latin American affairs. We will look at really concentrate on moralistic diplomacy in Mexico. We want to be able to describe America's response to World War I and explain how the increasingly sharp conflict over America's policies towards Germany. We want to be able to explain how domestic and foreign controversies played in Wilson's narrow victory over Hughes in the presidential election of 1916. We want to be able to explain what caused America to enter World War I, and you should be able to argue what you feel is the number one reason for America's entry into World War I. We want to be able to describe how Wilsonian idealism turned the war into an ideological crusade that inspired and overwhelmed dissent. We want to be able to discuss the consequences of World War I on the home front. How did we mobilize, and what does this mean for labor, women, and African Americans? We want to be able to describe America's economic and military role in the world. We want to analyze Wilson's attempt to forge a peace on his 14 points. His peace plan to make the world safe for democracy, to make this the war to end our wars, and also to be able to explain why developments at home and abroad forced him to compromise. And last but not least, we should be able to discuss the opposition of Lodge and others to Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations and show how Wilson's refusal to compromise doomed the Treaty of Versailles. Alright, looking at Woodrow Wilson's foreign policy. This was a new direction in foreign policy. Woodrow Wilson took a very different path in foreign policy when you compare it to his two predecessors. Wilson was a pacifist at heart and a peacemaker. And because of that, he hated this in-your-face policy of TR's big stick and that dollar diplomacy of William Taft. Woodrow Wilson felt like he could handle foreign affairs with a moral approach, hence the name that we give Wilson's foreign policy, moral diplomacy. Sometimes this is called missionary diplomacy, but it centers around the idea that the United States could influence the economics of Latin America by supporting the countries that were democratic. However, if a country was not democratic, their economies would suffer greatly, and therefore they would have no other choice but to cave into the pressure of the United States. Right away, we see Woodrow Wilson act on this idea of moral diplomacy. One, he got American bankers to pull out of a six-nation loan to China. Kind of turning his back on that dollar diplomacy of William Taft. Another way he turned away from dollar diplomacy is he got Congress to repeal the Panama Canal Tolls Act, which was allowing American ships to pass through the Panama Canal free of cost. Another thing that Woodrow Wilson did is that he signed the Jones Act in 1916. This granted territorial status to the Philippines. It also promised independence when a stable government was established. This is going to eventually put the Philippines on a path to independence, which they will be granted on July 4th, 1946. However, some other foreign situations forced Wilson, this pacifist, this peaceful president, to take action. Woodrow Wilson diffused a situation with Japan. What was happening was that California had or forbade Japanese Americans from owning land in the United States. This is going to cause tension to run high, and violence seemed like a real threat. So Wilson sent Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan to speak to the California legislature, and the situation was calmed down. Another incident where he was forced to take action, namely in Latin America, is that Wilson was forced to take military action in 1915 in Haiti. Chaos had erupted there, and Woodrow Wilson had sent U.S. Marines to protect Americans and American interests there. They stayed there for over a year and a half. Marines were also sent to the Dominican Republic in the same year to keep order. And in 1917, Woodrow Wilson purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark. It was clear by this time that the arms of America were reaching into Latin America, into Latin America and into the Caribbean, specifically speaking to Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and the Virgin Islands. Now, where do we see the United States and moralistic diplomacy venture into Latin America? Namely, we will look at, we will focus on diplomacy in Mexico. So for years, the resources of Mexico have been used by American oil companies, by American railroad companies, and by American mining companies. Thus, the Mexican people were extremely poor, and they revolted against the status quo in 1913. The president, as a result of this, the president of Mexico was assassinated, and placed as president was an Indian, General Huerta. The result of the chaos was a massive immigration from Mexico to Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And Huerta's regime put Wilson in a tight spot. The revolutionaries in Mexico, namely the revolutionaries under this new president, were violent. They threatened American lives and property. And so you see Americans call on Wilson to offer protection, but he would not. On the flip side, Wilson would also not recognize Huerta's regime. Remember, this is going against. If he recognized Huerta's regime and legitimacy as president, this would go against his whole idea of what moral diplomacy stood for. He wants to recognize democratic institutions and democratic leaders. So therefore, when he doesn't recognize Huerta, Wilson's going to allow American arms to go to Huerta's rivals, Carranza and Pancho Villa. To back off of that, what was happening, I guess, with Mexico politically, we do want to look at one or two incidences here that is going to cause the United States to intervene in Mexican affairs. The first one, the Tampico incident. So a situation emerges in Tampico, Mexico, when some American sailors were seized by Mexico. Woodrow Wilson sought Congress's approval to use military force and actually had the Navy seize Veracruz, Mexico. Both Huerta and his rival Carranza were not happy about this move. And so eventually we get the ABC powers, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, to step in and mediate the situation. After considerable pressure, Huerta is going to be replaced and Carranza is going to be president. Carranza's chief rival, Pancho Villa, then begins stirring up trouble. Pancho Villa was something of a Mexican Robin Hood. He was hated by some who considered him a thief and a murderer, but he was loved by others who considered him to be fighting for the little man. However, Pancho Villa makes a critical mistake if you're looking at it as gaining the unfortunate or gaining negative attention from the United States when he raids a train and kidnaps 16 American mining engineers and kills them. Then him and his men raided Columbus, New Mexico, so now they've actually crossed over into American territory, and he kills 19 more people. This is going to force Woodrow Wilson to send General John J. Pershing and the U.S. Army into Mexico, and this is to search for Pancho Villa. This is going to be known as the Pancho Villa raids. So General John Pershing is going to take a few thousand troops into Mexico, and he's going to fight Carranza's army. He's going to fight Pancho Villa's army, but he could never catch Pancho Villa. And while hunting for Pancho Villa, World War I is going to break out, and Pershing is going to be recalled, and Pershing's actually going to be named head of the American troops in Europe, or the American Expeditionary Force that's going to be fighting in Europe. And Pancho Villa is going to be soon murdered by a Mexican rival. And so we see that, you know, even though Woodrow Wilson wants to have this pacifistic or this moralistic approach to foreign affairs, some circumstances are going to force him to take military action in the Caribbean, take strong, aggressive military action in Mexico, and that military action in Mexico, in Veracruz and Tampico, excuse me, and the sending of troops into Mexico to search for Pancho Villa is going to cause the relationship between the United States and Mexico to become rocky and hostile. And we want to remember this when we look at World War I, and we look at what causes the United States entrance into World War I, and there's a specific incident that comes in January of 1917 dealing with Mexico and Germany. That's going to help push the United States towards war. And we want to remember these events that are happening in Mexico during Woodrow Wilson's time as president, during the earlier part, before the United States gets involved in World War I. And we want to look at these and remember these, and be able to kind of use these as a way to understand why Germany would reach out to Mexico. Why did they feel like this was a good idea, and they have a reasonable chance in Mexico becoming allies with them. We want to remember the United States and Mexico being on rocky ground due to some of the things that were happening there. So stay tuned in the next videos. We'll look at World War I beginning. We'll look at what the United States will do. Will we remain neutral in thought as well as in action? What makes this difficult? What do I mean by blood money? And we want to look at the 1916 election. And then stay tuned for some others as we outline the United States' involvement in World War I. We'll look at the home front, and then we'll look at the Treaty of Versailles, both what was in the actual treaty and what consequences or impact the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations has for Woodrow Wilson, for the Democrats, for progressivism, and for the United States as far as being an international player. So stay tuned for those.